Like previous books of history that we've studied and reviewed, Ezra and Nehemiah in Jewish tradition is one book, like Kings, Chronicles. English Bible, following again the Greek and Hebrew, will divide this into two separate books, the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah. They are contemporary reformers of the post-exilic period, and their ministries overlap, and so it makes good sense to put these together as one book. Ezra, the scribe, returns from Mesopotamia and brings a group of Hebrew expatriates back into Judah around 458 BC. Nehemiah will follow up a bit later. His date's 445 BC and beyond, and so they are contemporary reformers. Nehemiah will be an administrator and especially concerned about rebuilding the broken down wall of Jerusalem in places after the Babylonian siege. And so we have this complementary ministry, if you will. Nehemiah concerned about the physical condition of the city and wanting to rebuild that city of David and restore the wall of Jerusalem. Ezra is concerned about the spiritual health of his people. And so as scribe and priest, he's going to organize a covenant renewal ceremony, and we're going to have the reading of the Torah, and the people are going to respond and return to God. And so in this ministry, this combined ministry, we have the spiritual and the physical restoration of the Hebrew people and of the province of Judah and of that city of Jerusalem. And so that is the important backdrop for this story as we think about these contemporary reformers, Ezra and Nehemiah. Like much of the Bible, we don't have precise data as to authorship and composition. We know that both Ezra and Nehemiah composed memoirs, and those memoirs are part of this material. Who was the final author? Who was the final compiler? There's some discussion. Many scholars now think there was an anonymous chronicler, an anonymous compiler who took these records, these memoirs of Ezra and Nehemiah, and brought them together into a coherent history and brought about also that overlapping understanding of their ministries to get at those issues of both physical restoration and spiritual renewal. Clearly, there's theological motivation here on the part of the compiler. This is a theological history. We're concerned about God, His role among these people, and the response of these people to God. And so there's that theological overlay that's part really of the entirety of our Old Testament. And in this theological overlay of the compiler, of the author, there's that concern that we understand God's role as sovereign, as ruler of history and the nations. And so these two books begin with a reference, a citation of the Edict of King Cyrus that permits people groups, including Hebrews, to return to their homeland and rebuild, in this case, the Second Temple of Jerusalem. That's the same passage that concludes the history of the Chronicles. And so here we have a nice intersection reminding us that God indeed is the ruler of history, that God indeed is the one who raises up kings and sets them down according to Daniel chapter 2. And so the theological perspective here in this book is one that is a helpful reminder to the people that God is the one who is still orchestrating the events of Hebrew history. As we think about the composition of these two books, we want to just keep in mind the fact that we have first-person material from both Ezra and Nehemiah, the so-called memoir sections of these two books. And so, however we think about authorship, we want to make sure that we keep in mind the fact that we actually have first-person accounts from these two individuals as they give us their understanding of their role in the community and how they were fulfilling the commission and call that God gave them to return and to rebuild the people spiritually and to restore the city physically. And in that complementary ministry, accomplish the purposes of God as we think about the return from exile and the rebuilding of the Hebrew people in this post-exilic period. we've learned that this post-exilic period is a troubled time. The people of God, the Hebrew people, have assumed that perhaps the Word of God has failed them. They no longer can appeal to Davidic kingship. It's a memory. It's only history for them. And yet they had a covenant made with David, brokered by Nathan the prophet, that kingship would be a part of their experience. And so there's that loss, that sense of loss that we have no king. Where is the Davidic throne? The second temple's been built, but it pales in comparison to Solomon's temple. And so there's that sense of loss there too. We don't have the grandeur of that previous temple. It's second class, it's second rate in so many ways as a second temple. And so that also is feeding into the despair and in some cases the apathy of the Hebrew people at this time. And then despite the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah earlier about issues of social justice, we've lapsed back into carelessness and thoughtlessness in terms of our social structure and community. And we have oppressive conditions, and we have leadership that isn't necessarily paying attention to some of the covenant stipulations as we think about how a community should be relating to itself and to the wider people groups around them. And so we have that factor to deal with here as well. And then we have a group of hostile enemies. As the Hebrew people have rebuilt Second Temple and tried to restore the city and rebuild those walls, there are Ammonites and Arabs and some other people groups, Samaritans here, who have put up resistance and have complained and written letters to the Persian governors and the Persian overlords to stop this initiative, this rebuilding by the Jews, by the Hebrews. And so they've had opposition as well. So it's in the midst of all of that that we have these two complementary reformers doing their work, trying to assure the people that God indeed is still active and that they can be assured that those promises made by earlier prophets will eventually be realized. They also are told that now is the time to make sure that we obey, that we keep covenant obedience, that we are loyal to God, that our allegiance is in the right place as we wait. And so this is a time of transition, an important time of transition as we think about this, the background for Ezra and Nehemiah. There's a time of waiting. And in that waiting, they need to make sure that they step up and do the right things. They need to reaffirm their covenant relationship with God. They need to maintain that loyalty, and they need to follow through and obey those stipulations of keeping the Sabbath and of organizing life around the principles of Torah and having the sense of community where they bond together and indeed work and somehow manage their affairs as the people of God. The purpose and message of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah is straightforward. It's a continuation of post-exilic history. It's a way for the Hebrew people to document what has taken place by way of return. We had early return after the decree of Cyrus, and that event is marked and it's recognized as God working on behalf of his people. And then we have prophets who are going to stir the people up to make sure the second temple gets built and restored. And Haggai and Zechariah will see to the rebuilding of that second temple. And Zechariah especially is going to give the people encouragement as they think about repentance and return to covenant obedience and to social justice and to the practice of those stipulations and precepts of how we relate to God and to one another as we think about our worship and holy living in terms of the practice of the covenant code that we learned from Moses way back there at Sinai. And so that's part of what's happening here as we think about message and purpose, simply to document what's been taking place. But also there is this ongoing theological concern. God made a covenant with his people. Violation of covenant brought the people into exile. They were dismissed from the land, expelled, if you will. The Assyrians taking the northern kingdom, the Babylonians sweeping away the southern kingdom of Judah. And so covenant violation is in the minds of these leaders. Covenant renewal is the centerpiece, really, of these two books. Realigning, re-upping, showing allegiance, demonstrating that they indeed are on God's side. And so Ezra will lead the people in a covenant renewal experience, and that will become really the theological emphasis of this particular book as we complete and, in a sense, fill out the post-exilic history of the Hebrew people. The structure of the book of Nehemiah essentially follows the outline of its content. You have three missions, and the first mission is that initial return from exile in Babylonia. And here we have the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra. The rest of the book of Ezra is the second return, this second wave of expatriates that are coming back from Mesopotamia, from Babylonia, and repopulating the land under Ezra and Nehemiah. And so we have that second mission of return and restoration found in the last half of the book of Ezra. And then the first half of the book of Nehemiah is the third mission. It's that mission of restoring and rebuilding the city under the work of these two reformers. And then the last piece of the book is the covenant renewal. In Nehemiah chapter 7, 8, and following, we have a lengthy record of the covenant renewal experience that Ezra led the Hebrew people in and restored that relationship with God through that very, very important ceremony of covenant renewal. So the two books, essentially, by way of content, rehearse the initial return and rebuilding of the temple, second wave of return, and then the mission of restoration, the walls of the city, and renewal of the people through that covenant experience that Ezra will lead them in. We can comment on two themes as we think about the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in our concluding thoughts here. The first is, God's a covenant keeper. The Hebrew people need to be reminded of that. God keeps his word. God keeps his covenant. And they have to follow suit. They have to respond in kind. And that lesson is there throughout the Old Testament. God keeps his word. God keeps his covenant. And so these two books remind us that God is faithful to his covenant. The psalmist will also pick that up and just reinforce that for the Hebrew people. God remembers his covenant forever, we're told in Psalm 111. And so the storyline here is God is a covenant keeper. He keeps his word. A second theme is Torah. Covenant renewal is reorganizing this post-exilic Hebrew community around the law of Moses, around the Torah, around the instructions in holiness. And that's important because we want to reconnect and redevelop that relationship, but it also has implications for the future. The Hebrew people want to somehow make sure that these experiences of exile are not repeated. We don't want to go into exile again. Unthinkable. The tragedy of the loss of kingship, the loss of temple, the loss of lives, the loss of land. How do we prevent another exile? How do we prevent the unthinkable from happening again? Reorganizing our lives around the Torah. As time goes on, that thought, that emphasis of wanting to reorganize life around the Torah will take on a life of its own, and a second law will begin to develop, the so-called tradition of the elders. And so by the time of Jesus, in those gospel accounts that you read in your New Testament study, Jesus will encounter in and among the leaders of his people, those religious leaders, Traditions of men, he calls them. A second layer of law, which is understandable at one level. This was how the Hebrews tried to make sure that we don't go into exile again. What's the best way to prevent exile? Keep Torah. What's the best way to keep Torah? Maybe we should have more Torah. And so that will develop over time, and by the time of Jesus, we'll see that in place. And so keep that in front of you as you think about your movement from Old to New Testament, as you connect those dots, so to speak, from First Testament to Second, and issues of Torah. You can recall Ezra and Nehemiah and the issue of the law and its importance, and of preventing another exile.